The work that we're doing today and going forward in acknowledging our complicity in white supremacist systems is not about self-flagellation. So don't be ashamed about anything that has gone before. What I want this to mark is our own conversion to bring about change going forward. We trust that God is with us during our own conversion at this time. The work is going to be difficult, but as we are reminded in our renewal of our baptismal covenant, we will with God's help.
We are learning frequently that from ourselves and from others, that most of us white folks have a very simplistic notion about our own privilege, that we're not very good at tracking how our privilege serves us, nor how it blinds us. And so that's one of the areas we want to keep investigating.
I would like to speak about asking people to do an interview. We targeted people and pinpointed the people because we were wanting to start with the people who were more likely to decease. We had 2 that did before we talked to them. So we targeted people, and then we found that people in the congregation were complaining that they weren't asked. And then we put out a call for anyone who wanted to do it, and not one person said they wanted to do it. We started with a 10-person committee that was very diverse, and we now have 3 white ladies who work really hard.
The Wilderness Days. When the Indiana Territory was established in 1800, William Henry Harrison from Virginia, a slaveholder and Episcopalian, was appointed governor, and slavery continued to be tolerated through a series of laws enacted by the appointed legislature. By the time Indiana was granted statehood in 1816, the abolitionists were in firm control of the legislature, and slavery was banned in the Constitution. This, however, did not abolish racism. Nothing was done to enable any civil rights to the growing black population in Indiana. Blacks were not allowed to vote. They could not testify in court cases involving whites. They could not be part of white society in any way. This included attending white churches. In 1802, Absalom Jones was the first black person ordained as priest in the Episcopal Church.
Well, as the first black Episcopal priest in the tradition of our church, he was the one who enabled ministry like mine to be possible. The history of the Episcopal Church in America is one that's tied up with our colonial past, and he was able to, within those systems, find a path from being enslaved to freedom and then to leadership in the church. The congregation he started, St. Thomas African Episcopal Church, is still one of the most vibrant Episcopal churches in the country in Philadelphia. And so that legacy of his priesthood continues to this very day. And as the first black woman diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church, I trace my ability to be bishop to his presence as the first black priest in our church.
He's important because his life serves as a reminder that sometimes things are very, very difficult and challenging, and people will stand in your way. But even in a time where there's barrenness and hurt and pain, there is still the roots that come from the motherland, from Africa, to pull us forward. And with faith in God, we can see that something new can spring forth.
Racism manifests itself in many ways, through cultural norms of the time, legislated laws, and macro and microaggressions, just to name a few. Let's hear a story told in Eli Lilly's book, The Little Church on the Circle. This took place in January of 1840, a few years after Christ Church was founded. Upon the death of the church organist, Mrs. Morrison, Miss Sophia Spears was appointed to succeed her. Shortly thereafter, with the aid of a justice of the peace, Sophia married John Williams, a light-skinned mulatto. Immediately after the ceremony, a mob of ruffians appeared. John, the groom, fled the scene. Sophia was placed on a horse and paraded up and down Washington Street with a mob shouting vulgar remarks at her. On February 11, a petition of divorce was presented to the House of Representatives, signed by a large number of citizens of Indianapolis, asking for a dissolution of marriage between Sophia Spears and John Wilson. On that same day, it was read 3 times, and it passed 61 to 22. Immediately, a new law was passed prohibiting anyone with 1/8 part Negro blood from marrying a white and declaring any such marriage null and void. This law stayed on the books until 1965. A majority of the church members, along with the rector, thought the best interest of the church demanded Sophia's immediate resignation. This issue severely divided the membership. Bishop Kemper tried to find common ground. Neither side would compromise. On May 2nd, Sophia submitted her resignation to the vestry in order to keep peace in the parish. A majority of the congregation sided with an unjust, racist law, rather than respecting the dignity of the innocent organist. None of this was Sophia's fault. She had lost her husband and her job due to a racist situation in the church.
Dr. Horace Stringfellow. He's an incredibly complex figure and very much a product of his time. He was from an old family of Episcopal ministers from Virginia, and he was the rector of Christ Church until he was run out of town after ministering to Confederate prisoners at Camp Morton in 1863. There's a lot of discussion about what his ministry actually entailed, but I've found some records in the newspapers of the time. But that ministry included taking food and providing religious services to the prisoners, but also mailing letters for the prisoners in direct contravention of an edict from the governor and Camp Morton officials, which is pretty interesting to think about, that he was actively aiding and abetting in some small way Confederate prisoners at the time. Christ Church initially refused his resignation, but he left anyway. And he left in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War to become a chaplain in General Lee's ambulance corps in the Army of Northern Virginia. He returned after the war to be founding rector of St. Paul's from 1866 to 1870, when he left to be rector of St. John's, Montgomery, Alabama, until his death in 1893. After his death in 1893, there was a memorial in the old parish house, which was the Thomas A. Hendricks Memorial, that was converted into the Horace Stringfellow Memorial Chapel. You can see this here in the announcement for the memorial on the left-hand side. One of the chapels, as I said, was renamed, and All Saints now, after several years of not having one, now has the terracotta altar that appeared in the Horace Stringfellow Memorial Chapel. So with this in mind, just sort of thinking out loud, what do we do with the sacred objects at all parishes that tie us to these complex and potentially problematic histories? The Diocese of Indianapolis adopted this resolution regarding mission work among our Black brothers and sisters. This paternalistic mindset was very common of Christians of all faiths, not just Episcopalians, and as you can read, was very paternalistic and segregationalist, despite the best intentions of, they are best served through ministers of quote unquote their own race. This resolution was adopted by the 1883 Indianapolis Diocesan Convention and approved for implementation at the 1886 General Convention. So this was not just an Indianapolis thing. This was brought to the nationwide church and approved for use. It was designed to reinforce the social and racial hierarchies of the time. That hierarchy and the resolution from 1886 brings me to St. Phillips. St. Phillips was a colored mission, their words, not mine, in the Indiana Avenue neighborhood, and it was contemplated as early as 1881. But it was not allowed to use the facilities of St. James Mission, which was under the control of St. Paul's, and were right across the street from the current lot of St. Phillips. St. Phillips was established in 1886 after several years of these different resolutions that were passed. And you can see here on the left-hand side, that's the original church that stood at the corner of North and Minerva Street on what is now IUPUI's campus, right by the canal, for the growing Black population in the neighborhood. And at first, for these first 2 decades, it was an offshoot of Christ Church rather than of St. Paul's. It really lasted in earnest until 1893, when Reverend Benjamin Jack, he was the first Black priest in Indianapolis. He died suddenly, and so it just sort of fizzled out. There was not the clerical support for a mission in that neighborhood. None of the white clergy were willing to do so until 1901, when it was reconstituted as a mission of St. Paul's. This is again part of that paternalistic approach by the bishop and white diocesan leaders towards this flourishing Black congregation. And I want to point out, this is from 1894 from the Convention Journal of the Diocese of Indianapolis, and it indicates that St. Paul's was very busy with mission work, but it shows that in this first phase of St. Philip's development, St. Paul's stayed out of that neighborhood specifically. So it's sort of reading through the lines as to what folks in diocesan centers and in St. Paul's halls of power were willing to deal with, at least in the 1880s and 90s. However, that changed in 1901. You can read here from 1901 that a little bit of history. It was reconstituted under St. Paul's and under the charge of Reverend Lewis Brown. But I want to point out a couple of things about St. Phillips that are problematic, such as the name itself. It's an example of a colonialist attitude towards people of color, and it refers to Acts chapter 8, where St. Philip the Evangelist was baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. And this is a common name for historically Black Episcopal congregations throughout the country, not just in Indianapolis. Stuck in mission status, St. Philip's was until 1954, despite a relatively large congregation of 150 to 200 members, just because it was viewed as incapable of self-governance until 1954. The parish was the de facto parish for Black Episcopalians until 1960s, when All Saints and some other parishes, including St. Paul's, began to integrate. I also want to point out that despite the best intentions of those involved, the fact that the Black congregation of St. Philip's was made to worship in a chapel named after Horace Stringfellow, who was a Confederate chaplain with those tangible ties to the Confederacy, it's just insulting and paternalistic. But it was all about maintaining what was proper in that social order. Speaking of what is considered proper and who sets that tone, we have Thomas Hendricks, who was, among other roles, an attorney, the governor of the state, senator from the state, and the vice president for a spell. At the same time, he was senior warden of St. Paul's. And if you remember from earlier, he also headed the vestry at Christ Church when Stringfellow resigned during the Civil War.
The Great Migration and Sundown Towns. After slavery was abolished and African Americans began to move north for better wages, white communities began to revolt. They ran blacks out of their communities at sundown, under threat of violence or death, and enacted laws to keep them out. These communities are known as sundown towns. Sundown towns are all across the Midwest. There is a heavy concentration of them in Illinois and Indiana.
Redlining, which is different from the Red Line. The Red Line is a rapid transit bus line that came into effect a couple of years ago, and it is trying to actually counteract some of the effects of redlining, which was the nationwide policy of mortgage lending that drew actual red lines around Black neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods to indicate that those areas were high risk or dangerous to mortgage lenders. Effectively, redlining kept people who already lived in those areas from being able to access loans for housing, including homes they already lived in. This lowered rates of Black homeownership, increased reliance on predatory lending practices, and significantly lowered property values in these neighborhoods, as well as contributed to generational wealth gaps between Blacks and whites in Indianapolis and around the country. From this, external investment in neighborhood services and amenities dropped, increasing rates of poverty in those areas. These policies solidified trends from the Jim Crow era and occurred at a time when white flight was changing the city and those who lived in it, the ripple effects of which are still seen today. And I want to point out that this was official federal policy from 1935 to 1977. And Indiana had, I believe, 5 or 6 redlining maps, including Indianapolis, Terre Haute, Evansville, and Muncie and South Bend. And I think Fort Wayne was redlined as well, which affects other cities that have Episcopal churches in them. And you can see here, most of what was downtown is going to be redlined. Those categories were designed to enforce racial and class-based hierarchies throughout the country and in Indianapolis specifically. After 40 years of enforcement, the de facto segregation that resulted remains today. Many figures that were making these decisions were Christians and Episcopalians. And as parishes moved closer to be to their parishioners, and to the areas that they lived in, it was often on the coattails of these racist policies as white members were moving out of the downtown core to the suburbs. And I just want to show here an example of what one of these redlining cards would look like. So we have the map, and this card that I just showed is for this area right here, which is where St. Phillips and the Walker Theater Center are located. So they would compile all of this information and then redline the area with a particular color. So you can see here, there's some pretty gross language here about the detrimental influences and just nasty things that really show the true colors of what this was all about. And the area, again, for this was bounded generally by Indiana Avenue, West Street, and then 10th Street at the north. Connecting that to the Episcopal Church, you can see here that St. Paul's, even the current campus, would have been in a yellow lined area. It's right here, up here at the north, but sandwiched between green and blue. The Episcopal Church in Indianapolis and nationwide views and continues to view itself as a moral leader. Episcopalians were making the decisions on a diocesan, parish, and civic level as to where they were going to reside, how these maps were going to be drawn. Of particular note to St. Paul's and the Episcopal Diocese in Indianapolis are the elected officials who led the city and have set policy over time, including Thomas Hendricks, who was an early vestryman of St. Paul's, who served as governor of Indiana in the 1870s and was vice president of the United States in 1885. And the following mayors of Indianapolis, including John Caven, who served as mayor from 1863 to 1867, and again from 1875 to 1881, Thomas Sullivan, who served as mayor from 1890 to 1893, Thomas Taggart, who served from 1895 to 1901, John W. Holtzman, who served from 1903 to 1906, Reginald Sullivan, who served from 1930 to 1935 and 1939 to 1943, and Robert Tyndall, who served from 1943 to 1947. This is noteworthy because all of them were members of St. Paul's, showing that despite being a relatively small parish in a relatively small denomination in the city, members have had an outsized impact on local, state, and national affairs.
One thing that we did learn about the broader community, Bloomington, is that there were a lot of racially restrictive covenants attached to properties. And we were seeing some bits of evidence that this may have been connected to at least one property that the church owned. And we wanted to see if there were prominent parishioners for the clergy that had a hand in these racially restrictive covenants. But we also could see that this was an issue that was bigger than just our church. One prominent parishioner from Trinity is implicated in these racially restricted covenants, and her name is Agnes E. Wells. So she was involved in the signing of a racially restricted covenant on her property that forbid the property from ever being sold or rented to a colored person.
In the early 1920s, the Indiana KKK had 250,000 members. By 1925, over half the elected members of the Indiana General Assembly, the governor of Indiana, and many other high-ranking officials in local and state governments were members of the Klan. Politicians learned they needed Klan endorsement to win office.
In the 1920s then, the Ku Klux Klan held major sway in the city and in the state during the period from 1910 to about 1927. And many clergy and churches of all denominations supported the social platform, if not the organization itself. You can see here on the right-hand side of the screen is a directory of churches that were involved directly in the Klan. And it's pretty striking, I think. I do want to also point out that no Episcopal clergy or parishes were explicitly involved, but it still permeated the culture of our city.
The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a nonviolent social movement that campaigned from 1954 to 1968 to abolish legalized racial segregation. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. This, however, did not stop racism nor the problems for blacks in America. There was a great pushback from the white establishment, which caused violent civil unrest. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 led to the dissolution of a unified civil rights movement. What was the Episcopal Church's response to this civil unrest? In response to the nationwide outbreak of violence and disregard for the unjust laws, Bishop Crane organized an ecumenical service to honor law enforcement agencies in 1966. St. Paul's was the host of this event. In the 1967 General Convention, approximately half of the black Episcopal clergy signed a declaration by priests who are Negroes. It was addressed to the white leadership of the church and denounced the second-class treatment of the African American clergy. After the 1967 General Convention, a special convention was called and held in 1969 to address the racial unrest and the church's complicity. The special convention represented an enormous break with the status quo and past leaders, black and white. It spotlighted the church at a time of extreme turmoil, division, and dramatic confrontation. The past Episcopal Church treated African Americans as a problem, culturally and socially separated and inferior. But by baptism, they were full and equal members of the community, but still segregated. The church tried to mend this breach by ministering to black Americans separately, consecrating bishops for colored work, establishing black congregations, and operating a special office for Negro work. In short, the Episcopal Church fully embraced the American separate but equal construct of race relations. How did this affect our black brothers and sisters? Here are some stories.
Many of the things, when I started to think about experiences that I had, some of them were microaggressions. They're not really things that they're so definitive or so obvious. But when you're an African American, you learn what those things mean. And one of the things that I've always noticed is people typically say to me, "Oh, you're so well spoken." And by that, they mean you're so well spoken for a Black person, as well as one of the things that I've always noticed, it's a kind of minimizing and marginalizing you. And you typically know when someone is uncomfortable or dislikes you. I've had people, this is way pre-COVID, that sometimes in the peace people shake hands. And I've had people that would not shake my hand. I've had people that when I spoke to them, they didn't respond back with hello. I've had people that so that they didn't have to pass the peace with me, that they averted their eyes or their distance or turned their back so they didn't have to give me the peace. I have been in seating situations where it was a big event, and I can't remember if it was a funeral or a program, but this woman didn't want to sit next to me, and when I came on the aisle, she went as far as she could. Well, as the aisle started to fill up, and it made her have to be in closer proximity to me, she got up and left the aisle. I had another lady just straight out told me that she always sat in the very back of the church because she didn't want to pass the peace with Black people. And she didn't, and this was a person of some importance in the church. And so they gave her communion by herself because she didn't want the chalice with Black people. She told me this. The other thing that I've had experience is people will ask me, "Well, you're not a Cradle Episcopalian, are you?" It's that sort of sense of that you're other. It's that sense of when someone looks you in your face and you know they don't view you as the same thing as them.
Terrible mischief of segregating ourselves in the church in Indianapolis that I know of. It's so hurtful to me trying to live Christ, and yet I'm living in this division and in this outrage towards me in my color, then my being gay, then my being intelligent. Now this church has come to more or less recognize in some degree I'm intelligent, but I've been told by one of the priests here I was called a monkey. And you can smooth it over, you can butter it up, you can act like it never happened, all you want. But enough folks are witnesses to the mishaps, the ultimate evils, and the betrayal of Christian faith in each other. That would prostitute the reason to have a faith. I've been Black all my life. To walk in the white church and not feel like I'm part of it, part of the congregation and part of the people, is no different than being outside the church. So the racism in the church is a still racism. It's an unspoken racism. It's an unacted racism. But it is a racism. Superiority of being the King's Church, which is the essence of the social, racial animosity and hostility that slavery maintained and pervades our society. It's an underbelly of our society in all of our institutions, all of our social, political, and public circumstances, our private circumstances.
Well, I guess I didn't know this at the time, but I guess I can say that it started as a child. I'm a Cradle St. Phillips member, and joined, of course, when I was young, little, and me and my sister and my mother. And at the time, St. Phillips was the only Black church in our state. And that's all that I knew was St. Phillips. That's where we went every Sunday. And but I figured out something was wrong with us, or at least I felt something was wrong with us. Periodically, they would have the children meet for overnights with other groups from other churches. And I always got a feeling of, like something was wrong with us, or they looked at us, not the parents, but the children looked at us with a different eye. And I just could never figure that out. And as I got older, I did. Then we also, our diocese would have a celebration in May down at Christ Church. And we did this every year. And they asked for all the choirs to come. And me and my sister, we were in the choir. And we dressed, and everybody processed in and whatnot. And it was just a big thing. It was all day long, beautiful. It was always on a Saturday in May. And then after the service was over, everyone went next door to the Columbia Club. But the people from St. Phillips didn't go. We went on back to our church. And it wasn't until later that I found out and figured out why we didn't go over there, because they didn't allow Black people in the Columbia Club. So we went on back to St. Phillips on Northwest Street. And then, of course, we went on home. So that went on for quite some time. And then as time went on, we were still at St. Phillips, and St. Phillips was just in their own little, that was my haven. And there at the time when the old St. Phillips was there, which was 1 block south of where the one is now, across the street was a place called the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA. And so a lot of times our gatherings would take us over there to the Y. Children from our church, we would meet there for meetings and various other things. So I didn't know anything else other than meeting with my fellow Black friends. And we either met in the church or we met at the Y. And, you looked at the church as a safe haven, someplace to go. So the big kicker came in, I guess, 1964, when my parents bought a house over on West Kessler, which was right around the corner from St. Paul's. So I was in my teens then, and my sister had started college, and my mom, she was a social worker here in town. My dad was a dentist, and mom went over, she walked over to St. Paul's one day, and she went into the rectory, and she said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm new to the area, and I would like to talk to you about joining St. Paul's Church." And the person that she talked to asked her, "Well, where are you going now?" And she said, "Well, we've been going to St. Phillips, my girls and I, we've been going there since they were born." And he said, "Oh, St. Phillips down on Northwest Street?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I can say this to you. I guess this is the story that she told me. He said, "I think that that's the best place for you, and that just to keep on going there." He did not welcome her, didn't say anything, or just, just more or less said, bye, see ya. And she was very hurt by that and came home. And my dad, had some words to say about that, because he, in his role, he was on a lot of boards in town and fought civil rights and had done that all of his life. And just, that was just another dagger in her side, or their side. And as I said, this was 1964. So if you know your civil rights, what was going on then. So we basically stayed at St. Phillips, and I'm still there. And to this day, I have never set foot in St. Paul's.
I would say the Black presence in the Episcopal Church is a part of who we are, just because, again, of our history of colonialism and enslaved people. And so the fact that this is a church, not always perfectly, but it's a church that strives to be inclusive of all the people of God. When we say that God loves all without exception, and we offer a welcome to anyone who wants to walk in the ways of Jesus in the way that we do, then that's an exciting thing. And so as Black people, we have a history that is about not just seeking justice and seeking to dismantle the structures of racism that have hobbled our country and our expression in this country, but we, I think, are here as a part of helping the church be who God wants it to be, which is a place that reflects the full diversity of God and the people of God. And so we're not whole as a church. No church is whole unless we are expressing the full image of God in all of our beautiful diversity, whatever language, whatever color, whatever our background. To be the church means that everyone has a place, and for Black Episcopalians in this country, our place in this church and in this country is a gift. And I think as we look forward to whatever God has in store for the future, the legacy of Absalom Jones, the legacy of Polly Murray, the first Black woman priest in the Episcopal Church, the legacy of Barbara Harris, the first female bishop in the world in the Anglican Communion, who happened to be a bishop in the Episcopal Church, Black woman. All of that is a part of us helping to tell the story of God working through the people of God, and particularly some Black folk, to be able to do some amazing things to transform our world for the better.
I'm very glad that I get to be a member of the Union of Black Episcopalians, an organization that has stood for justice and hope and change in the Episcopal Church, specifically as it relates to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We have a difficult history in the Episcopal Church, but change is coming and change is here. And so what I see the role of the Union of Black Episcopalians, or UBE, is that we can help spearhead that change, and that we can encourage people, but we can also prod them forward. One of the things that are happening now are Sacred Ground, which is an opportunity for people, especially not of color, to learn a bit more about what it's like to walk in these shoes. So I have a great deal of hope for us as a denomination, as a people of faith, and I'm thankful that UBE has stood for decades to say, yes, African Americans are here, we're part of the Episcopal Church, we matter, we have something to offer you, and we would like to share our life together in a deeper way.